or the gruesome plans the Nazis had since, well, fascism has been popularized by those such as Mussolini and the Nazis. But there's also a different society concerned with the master race ideology or thought process, which comes from the Japanese. Now, the Japanese have historically been isolated from every other culture that they themselves did not want to deal with. Now, that's not true today, but it was true a long time ago. Many believed that the only way towards glory was a form of warrior-like status, and the only true salvation was serving the emperor. It's probably not, unique to the Japanese. This has happened in many cultures before. It's just kind of like the normal human psychology. But we're gonna also learn about how humans can be trained to not feel anything and look at their lives as only a path towards glory and death for the national interest. Now, this comes from many different reasons. A lot of behaviors brought by expansion and economic turmoil. Now, since Japan was isolated and growing within a world economy built on globalization and opening up of resources through global commerce, that just couldn't be. So you can't isolate yourself for long until someone comes and shows you their power and technology that surpasses yours, and then shows you that if you don't succumb to the will of the economy, then your own civilization will suffer. And the Japanese had to choose whether they were going to fight back against these far more advanced weapons, or to hold off until at one point reach a level much greater than those of Western and mainly European and Russian powers or technologies were surpassed. And that's really what happened, and they were invaded, and they had to sign a treaty and many other treaties after that. So the only choice was to wait and invest in the young and have them learn the techniques and knowledge of these far more advanced technologies, the development of weapons and scientific endeavors that our humanity has been doing for a long time, just to conquer and show that some are just more powerful than others. That again goes to the human psychology, that when you have society or somebody that's able to conquer much less technologized civilization is very easy to think and do. And that's what happened, and they held off for a long time until finally they decided, in fact, their whole economy grew for this whole investment. The investment of the young to learn new knowledge and new abilities to send back to their country. And that's what happened, and this happened for a while in the 1800s up until the economic crash. And after that, it was inevitable that the Japanese had back then had to think of why that was happening and why all that prosperity that was once there is no longer there, or had no longer been there after all the investment and work that they had done. And with economic growth comes a surplus of more individuals, more birth rates, and there was a lot of people to take care of, and the Japanese couldn't really feed all of their people. One way of feeding more people and allowing for more agriculture is by conquering other islands or more land. And that's what they did. They tried. They failed many times. But I'm not going to focus on that right now. And this is also all coming from a book I have just read by a talented journalist, historian you might call, a historian, researcher. It goes by the name of Iris Chang, and she immigrated to the U.S. Now, she had heard a lot about a certain crisis that happened in a place called Nanking that many didn't really report on or really kept in their history books for a long time. I mean, back then there was word of what was happening in Nanking, but it was only a small amount of time, or for several years, until inevitably somehow it had gotten forgotten. It got forgotten and was no longer in the history books. And she, growing up, had heard stories from her parents about the massacre and atrocities that happened in Nanking. Since she never really got the opportunity to hear about it in history books and many other literary work, she inevitably found out later in life and by activist groups showing pictures and material that proved that there was a massacre in Nanking that is one of the worst ever perpetuated by humanity. Now, the Japanese are not alone the Japanese in those days are not alone in those same tactics and atrocities. One may think of the Green Battalion or other groups who use these horrific ways of killing and destroying whole people's culture, by way of humiliating them publicly and making them believe that their lives were meaningless. Though, ironically, the Japanese soldiers in those days were also trained to think about their whole lives as meaningless, and because of that they thought of other people as even lower than theirs, or lower than them. And this also happens by the educational system. This isn't hard to think about if one were to create a whole civilization built on killing and overthrowing people psychologically, physically, and in any other way, is by creating an educational system built on military conquest and military-minded people, by dehumanizing every single part of their being, making them believe that that is the way that the world works. Well, that is possible, and it has happened. And the way that this happens is by, propagandizing a false history, a fantastic story about your own race and your own civilization and how great it is, that the only way towards salvation is through service and loyalty. And on December 13th, 1937. And this was all after the whole assimilation process towards dehumanizing everybody and making them believe that other humans were not necessarily as important as they are. This is not to say anything bad about the Japanese today, because one can't go back in the past and fix all these problems that had occurred. I, for one, don't believe in time travel, but I'm sure there's some technocrats out there that do. But that's impossible, in my view. And the only thing we can do is at least look back and acknowledge the history so that we know the methods and tactics used in the past to create a whole totalitarian system, and at the same time given the ability to destroy a whole ancient culture and ancient ways of life. So what we can do is we can look at we can look back at history. And now this history about the massacre at Nanking is not something really talked about today, or at least it wasn't for a long time until very recently. At least a lot of civilizations or nations in the world, I find don't know anything. At least I never found anything, not even a single word of Chinese culture or anything. I don't know anything too deeply about that, at least for me. And I would imagine it's the same for a lot of other people. But it's important that we acknowledge them and what happened to them, or even in things that they are doing or have done. So right now I'll be talking about, with all that said, I'll talk about a part in this book that was written by a soldier here in Iris Chang's book, The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. Here goes. Some Japanese soldiers admitted it was easy for them to kill because they had been taught that next to the emperor, all individual life, even their own, was valueless. Asuma Shiru, the Japanese soldier who witnessed a series of atrocities in Nanking, made an excellent point about his comrades' behavior in his letter to me. During his 2 years of military training in the 20th Infantry Regiment of Kyoto Fukuchiyama, he was taught that loyalty is heavier than a mountain, and our life is lighter than a feather. He recalled that the highest honor a soldier could achieve during war was to come back dead. To die for the emperor was the greatest glory. To be caught alive by the enemy, the greatest shame. If my life was not important, Asuma wrote to me, an enemy's life became inevitably much less important. This philosophy led us to look down on the enemy and eventually to the mass murder and ill treatment of the captives. In interview after interview, Japanese veterans from the Nanking massacre reported honestly that they experienced a complete lack of remorse or sense of wrongdoing. Even when torturing helpless civilians, Nagatomi Hakudu spoke candidly about his emotions in the fallen capital. I remember being driven in a truck along a path that had been cleared through piles of thousands and thousands of slaughtered bodies. Wild dogs were gnawing at the dead flesh as we stopped and pulled a group of Chinese prisoners out of the back. Then the Japanese officers proposed a test of my courage. He unsheathed his sword, spat on it, and with a sudden mighty swing he brought it down on the neck of a Chinese boy cowering before us. The head was cut clean off and tumbled away on the group as the body slumped forward, blood spurting in two great gushing fountains from the neck. The officer suggested I take the head home as a souvenir. I remember smiling proudly as I took his sword and began killing people. Now, this isn't even the worst part. There had also been a lot of gruesome attacks on women as well as men, but especially women who were raped and then killed and cut and boiled, burned, shot at, left to rot, and all kinds of other gruesome details. One can imagine what some sadistic person might think of doing, such as cutting someone open while still being alive, and such acts as those. Now, one might ask, how many were killed? Well, millions were killed in the span of several years. The gruesome facts about Nanking is one to really look at, because though not as many people in total were massacred, which was 66 million Jews, probably more than that, and Stalin more than 40 million Russians. And here is another part in the book, just to give the amount of time that all these people were massacred in Nanking. I'll just read a part in this book. Indeed, even by the standards of history's most destructive war, the Rape of Nanking represents one of the worst instances of mass extermination. To imagine its comparative size, we must brace ourselves for a few more statistics. The death toll of Nanking, one Chinese city alone, exceeds the number of civilian casualties of some European countries for the entire war. Great Britain lost a total of 61,000 civilians. France lost 108,000. Belgium 101,000. And the Netherlands 242,000. Air bombing is considered by those who reflect on these things one of the most awesome instruments of mass destruction. Yet even the worst air attacks of the war did not exceed the ravages of Nanking. It is likely that more people died in Nanking than in the British raids on Dresden and the firestorm that followed. The figure 225,000 was accepted internationally at the time, but more objective accounts now place the number of Dresden casualties at 60,000 dead, and at least 30,000 injured. Indeed, whether we use the most conservative number, 260,000, or the highest, 350,000, it is shocking to contemplate that the deaths at Nanking far exceeded the deaths from the American raids on Tokyo, an estimated 80,000 through 112,000 deaths. And even the combined death toll of the two atomic blasts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the end of 1945, estimated at 140,000 and 70,000 respectively. The Rape of Nanking should be remembered not only for the number of people slaughtered, but for the cruel manner in which many met their deaths. Chinese men were used for bayonet practice and in decapitation contests. An estimated 20,000 through 80,000 Chinese women were raped. Many soldiers went beyond rape to disembowel women, slice off their breasts, nail them alive to walls. Fathers were forced to rape their daughters, and sons their mothers, as other family members watched. Not only did live burials, castration, the carving of organs, and burying people to their waist and watching them get torn apart by German shepherds. So sickening was the spectacle that even the Nazis in the city were horrified, one proclaiming that the massacre to be the work of bestial machinery. Yet the Rape of Nanking remains an obscure incident. Unlike the atomic explosions in Japan or the Jewish Holocaust in Europe, the horrors of the massacre of Nanking remain virtually unknown to people outside Asia. The massacre remains neglected in most historical literature published in the United States. So that's quite astonishing that happened in just a few weeks. And it's not impossible to see that happening somewhere else at some point. I hope no one obviously wants that, but from what most people know today and how people have yet to learn much from history, it could one day happen if we don't be careful. And that is the writing of Iris Chang. It's quite astonishing that could happen in just a few weeks. To get rid of that many bodies is quite some work, to say the least. Now I will be continuing on this subject in the future. Also, some background on Iris Chang. She died in 2004, and some say it's quite suspicious that the way she died. You could research this, and that's pretty much what I wanted to say in this part. And I'll be talking about Japan and China in the future. And I just wanted to connect this to the technocratic way in which people and humanity can very easily forget a very important part of history and not even notice. So it's important, for me at least, to say something about it and try to understand it. Thank you. Later.